welcome to the Acid Trash Jamboree, and to a review of a hyper-weird movie that I never thought in a million years would get the swanky Blu-ray treatment, but thankfully, here we have it. Yeah, Bruce Toscano's 1984 effort, The Jar, initially titled Charon after the character in Greek mythology, which languished in crusty VHS obscurity for 40 years, until the excellent TerrorVision label did the right thing and rescued it from the abyss. Okay, so in this, Gary Wallace stars as Paul, a lank-haired, bearded fellow who ends up in a living nightmare following a car crash. Yeah, after offering help to the strange old man that he collided with, Paul unwittingly inherits one of his belongings, a cursed jar containing a small demonic creature. This pint-sized menace proceeds to upend Paul's entire existence, subjecting him to a barrage of increasingly bizarre and terrifying hallucinations, and generally turning him into a sweaty, sickly, paranoid mess, barely able to function in the real world anymore. And yeah, despite his best efforts to dispose of the jar and be free from its clutches, it always seems to find its way back to him. In the meanwhile, Paul meets Crystal, a female neighbour of his, who clearly has the hots for him and wants to help ease his troubled mind. Crystal may just end up regretting pursuing him with such vigour though, as Paul spirals even further down into the pit of demonic possession, and lives are put in danger. Okay, so I first heard about this movie in The Amazing Nightmare USA, an enormous book about 70s and 80s independent horror and exploitation, written by Stephen Thrower, who underground music fans will no doubt also be familiar with via his involvement with groups like Coil and Cyclobe. And yeah, as soon as I read his review, I knew I needed to check The Jar out somehow. Though, as I said at the start of the episode, outside of its original VHS edition, back then it was pretty difficult to actually track it down to give it a watch. Thankfully, in about 2018 or so, a rip of the VHS popped up here on YouTube. The picture was cropped and the audio only came out of one speaker, but it was better than nothing. This viewing propelling The Jar to the top of my Blu-ray wish list. So yeah, it took a few more years of patient waiting, but eventually it materialised in 2024. TerrorVision finally presenting the film in the correct aspect ratio, with immaculately cleaned up picture quality, and with a decent clutch of extra features. Now, over the past decade or so, The Jar has gained a rep as being utterly terrible, mostly thanks to it being featured on the American comedy show Best of the Worst, in which the hosts declared it to be so worthless that they ended up destroying a VHS copy of the film in a jar of acetone. If you ask me, this is pretty unfair. Yeah, way back before this restored Blu-ray version finally presented the movie as it was always meant to look, even that crappy, butchered by the distributor's video version had quite a lot to offer if you were after something off the beaten track. Okay, so if you have no time for arty, non-linear, experimental films, then fair enough. The Jar is best left alone, no matter which version you're viewing. Same if you're expecting heaps of OTT gore and action sequences. Yeah, forget it, because you're not going to find much of that here. If, however, you have the patience to immerse yourself in a surreal, disorientating, cinematic liminal zone for 90 minutes, then there are many pleasures to be derived from Toscano's lone feature. Yeah, as I said, the hellish visions that the jar creature subjects Paul to get ever more outlandish and illogical, leading to some strikingly memorable imagery. The moody, Suspiria-styled lighting and awkwardly stilted post-dubbed dialogue adding greatly to the film's sense of psychedelic dislocation. Indeed, imagine if Argento, Fulci, Lynch and Ulli Lommel had ever got together to direct a rough approximation of the classic short story The Monkey's Paw, and you might get somewhere close to the trippy madness of the jar. As for the demon itself, despite looking like the precursor to one of those rubber boggling toys from later on in the 80s, it still ends up being oddly creepy. Its bulbous eyes and unchanging sinister facial expression, again up in the movie's uncanny weirdness factor by a few notches. Then as for the film's musical score, well, it's just the rotten cherry on the cake. Yeah, credited to a project named Obscure Size, which was actually just the duo of Toscano and director of photography Cameron McLeod. If you're an analog synth nerd or progressive electronic nut, then you'll be all over this. The director citing acid trash faves like Goblin and Tangerine Dream as his primary musical inspirations. Now, I've said before on the channel that I rarely bother with extra features nowadays, as more often than not, they're just a chore to get through. However, I made an exception for the jar. And yeah, as well as the expected commentary tracks and trailer, we get a bunch of illuminating on-camera interviews with Toscano, Wallace, and writer George Bradley. Toscano actually tearing up at one point over the fact that his much maligned movie is finally getting some respect. So a great edition overall and well worth picking up. As I say, if you're into the weirder, more hallucinatory style of 80s horror filmmaking. It might have been nice if the package had included a separate bonus CD with the awesome soundtrack on it, as companies like Severin and Vinegar Syndrome have been known to do. But unfortunately, that's not the case here. The TerrorVision sub-label Cellar Dweller did eventually release the soundtrack earlier in 2026, but it was a hyper-limited, vinyl-only affair which sold out in no time. Anyways, that's just about it for today. If there's such a thing as the perfect acid trash movie, then The Jar would definitely be a contender. So I'm very pleased to have finally covered it on the channel. If this is your first time here, then feel free to check out the archive for even more videos showing and discussing obscure music and cinema. Until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you again soon on the Acid Trash Jamboree.